I would love to warmly welcome you to the plenary that is entitled New Pathways to Funding Resilience, Navigating the Ecosystem Together. And here we are today with the kind moderation of Willeke, who I will introduce in a moment, and a few other panelists to discuss this very important topic and to also hear from everyone in the room. So I hope you will enjoy the session. And it's my pleasure again to introduce Willeke, who's kindly agreed to moderate this session. Willeke is a senior leader who has been working as a CEO of Resource Alliance since 2022. She also previously led the strategy and analysis team at SOS Children's Villages and spent 13 years at Oxfam as a global fundraising strategy advisor, and worked across the world in countries like Mexico, India, South Africa, Brazil, Italy, Germany, and Belgium. And she also provided strategic fundraising oversight and research and development for new fundraising markets and channels, including entry, setup, and market development. She lived and worked in Mexico, Nepal, and India, and now lives in London. And it's wonderful that you are joining us today, Willeke. Thank you so much, and over to you for the introduction.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Vera, and a real pleasure being here. And to everyone present, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Resource Alliance, a global community of over 30,000 fundraisers, campaigners, and change makers. And welcome to this session about new pathways to funding resilience and navigating the ecosystem together. For decades, funding for disaster risk education and resilience has largely come from ODA and institutional grants. That funding remains absolutely critical, especially for locally led civil society organizations working closest to risk. But the funding landscape is clearly shifting. We are now seeing philanthropy shifting to flexible and trust-based approaches, the initial first ones, regional and pooled funds emerging. We see private sector partnerships. We see insurance and risk financing tools, social enterprising models, climate finance and impact investments. So the key question is not necessarily what replaces ODA. Instead, it's maybe how do we build a more diverse and complementary financing ecosystem that actually works for communities most exposed to risk. So beyond diversification, we also need to ask, are these changes accessible to local and community-led actors, or reinforcing existing barriers and lack of collaborations or lack of connections? This session is looking at the inside of that evolving ecosystem. We want to explore what donors and funders are really changing in their strategy, where the genuine opportunities are for civil society organizations working on resilience, and how different financing mechanisms might work together rather than competing. And of course, it also looks as what does this require for organizations like yours internally to really succeed? We want this to be a conversation, and we would love to hear from you as a community at GNDR too. So many of you are navigating this funding landscape every day, and you might have a lot of reflections and ideas and examples yourself. And please use them in the Q&A chat during this session so that others can build on it as well. This session will be joined by a great panel, and I would love to introduce the different panel members to you. Jessie Krafft is the president and the CEO of CAF America, where she leads the organization's mission to streamline safe, regulatory, compliant global grant making for North American donors and their international charitable partners. Ali Neumann, head of the expert group Disaster Risk Reduction and Environment of the Swiss Humanitarian Aid Unit, as part of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And then we have Emma Karhon, head of public-private partnership at Aon, and Aon is the world's second largest insurance broker. And we have Zameer Ahmad. He is Program Development Advisor at Sustainable Development and Response, also known STAR Foundation, based at District Wak of Pakistan-administered Kashmir. an NGO dedicated to strengthening community resilience, disaster risk reduction, and locally led emergency response across the Kashmir region in Pakistan. Welcome, everyone, and it's really great to have you here in this session. I would love to start with the shift in funding and what it means for a direct response organization. Zameer, could you maybe share your journey in diversifying your income streams at Star Foundation?
Well, thank you, Willeke. To answer your question about our journey, I need to take you back to where we started. Star Foundation was born in the immediate aftermath of the 2005 earthquake in District Bagh region of Pakistan administered Kashmir. Like many local organizations, we were driven by pure volunteerism, the desire to serve our neighbors. For years, we survived on small contribution and sheer willpower. But we realized quickly that passion alone does not build resilience, systems do. We wanted to move from reactive charity to proactive, sustainable development, but we hit a wall. We did not know how to success the structured funding that could scale our impact. The world of institutional funding, filled with acronyms, compliance frameworks, and law frames, felt like a closed door. The turning point was our engagement with the local leadership academy. This was just training. This was not just training, it was like that unlocked that door. Before LLA, we had community trust, but we lacked the language of donors. The course taught us how to align our grassroots work with our global frameworks like the SDGs and DRR. Armed with this new capacity, we successfully targeted and secured the project titled Sustainable Water Conservation and Management for Climate Resilience Project with TVO, our donors. This was a major milestone, a contract worth of over 1.4 million part rupees, but the real proof of our journey was in the implementation. Because of professional mindset we gained, we optimized our procurement. By bulk purchasing water tanks, we secured a discount that allowed us to acquire an extra tank. We installed that in a local school and distributed leftover gutters to 4 additional households. In the end, we reached 53 households and over 512 beneficiaries, exceeding our initial target of 50 households and 445 beneficiaries. This project is a testament to our journey. It shows that diversification is not just about finding money, it's about building the organizational capacity to attract it through strategic learning and adaptation. Thank you very much. That's from my side.
Thanks very much, Zameer, to exchange that with us. I really want to hand over to Jessie. Jessie, CAF releases every year the World Giving Report, and we see a lot of shifts and dynamics happening there. Could you maybe enlighten us with some of the highlights from the report? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you in this space. So CAF released our 2025 World Giving Report last fall. And this report had two parts. The donor side of it surveyed 55,000 donors in 101 countries, as well as thousands of charities on the charity report in 27 countries. And we were really looking at giving patterns globally and better understanding the experiences of charities with a specific focus on charity resilience. I'll share just a few learnings from this report that speak to the opportunities for organizations to focus on resilience and what we were seeing in the funding patterns globally. It's important to note, actually, that while the report was released in the fall, the survey was taken in early 2026. Early 2025. So we will be looking at this again this year to understand how the shifts in the funding landscape over 2025 really impact these results. So look for more to come from this report later this year. But from the 2025 report, everyone on this call recognizes, of course, the importance of diversity in income streams, and it won't come as a surprise to you that that came out as a really important element in this survey. But also importantly, we learned that in this report that those charities that have the least diverse income streams are also more likely to be in lower income countries, and then are also, as resulting, those who are most likely to have the greatest proportion of their funding actually restricted to specific projects, which doesn't enable flexibility, as you know. And then it is those organizations that have less resilience to weather the challenges that they may face. So, the data shows that in lower income countries, we estimate that 28% of funding is unrestricted, while this goes up by nearly half again in high income countries to 40% of funding being unrestricted. So, and these are really important contexts to understand, because then it feeds into, some of what we recommend in terms of building the funding base and charity resilience for certain organizations. But on cross-border giving specifically, since this was a dynamic that was greatly impacted during 2025, we found that charities that receive all of their funding from other countries, so from cross-border foreign sources, only have 14% funding that is unrestricted, compared to 41% for those organizations that receive funding from within their country. So localized giving is, enables more autonomy. It is more resilient. And this generally makes sense given that some of the legal requirements of cross-border giving that are coming from certain donor countries are more complex and, in some cases require restricted giving or require giving to a specific project in order to comply with the regulations in that country. So that does make sense, but it's important to note that as you're looking at diversifying funding, but then also looking at more flexible, unrestricted funding. But these two data points together really do highlight the importance of understanding, building local cultures of giving, and then, building unrestricted funds to enable resilience. The last point I'll just note on this is from actually a different resource. The Center of Effective Philanthropy has been doing surveys on U.S. foundations, so foundations based in the U.S., asking them how they're changing their giving habits. And the most recent report in January reported that 30% of foundation CEOs had increased their payout. So we are seeing some response from private foundations in the U.S. that are increasing their payouts. And then another 15% were considering an increased payout. So that's positive. But many foundations in the U.S. are still in a great period of indecision, kind of thinking about how they are going to react to this time of the massive changes in funding we've seen from government sources around the world.
Thanks, Jessie, for that. And just maybe a critical note from my end. Well, I salute that the foundations and trusts are increasing their funding. The international transfers are around 70 billion when it comes to foundations and trusts. If we see what we lost with ODA, that is around 80 to 100 billion. So they should have to double at a minimum to kind of cover that gap what we have just realized. So just as a warning message to everyone in the audience, diversifying is crucial at the moment if you're highly dependent on this ODA funding. Maybe talking about ODA, Ali, we can head to you, and I'm really curious if you can maybe share your light a bit about what is happening at ODA, but also how does your organization, the Swiss government, look at priority setting there, and what is shifting? Do you pay a lot of attention towards new funding models? What about localization? Could you share a little bit your light from a funder's perspective?
Yeah, hello, everybody. I guess I represent a traditional donor here, source of financing. They are still important. Switzerland, however, is also getting under pressure. We also have a reduction in our funding. Sometimes it doesn't appear so badly because the Swiss franc is getting higher. So in US dollars, for example, we manage to stay at the same level. No, it's going down. what is maintained is humanitarian aid, because this is considered to be a tradition, and people can relate to it very personally. And DRR has disaster risk reduction has historically been part of it, so it is somewhat shielded there. And so my advice is always we here in this community are working on disaster risk reduction normally, or integrated risk management. So that's a good entry point. Keep that. And the other one is climate finance. That's going up. Actually, DRR, what is branded DRR, is getting a little bit under pressure too, because we have to put funds into the climate funds. Regarding localization, that's a clear message from our directorate, and we are now saying why not local? It has to be local by norm. Otherwise, explain why. That's far more easier to say than done. We have funding with priorities. I mean, we have the UN system, we have the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. Those get a lot of funding still, and other multilateral actors. And then we have geographical programs. So this is to say that the room for flexibility is reduced by those, but we do have room for exploring new options. Insurance, since some time already, African risk capacity, for example, farmer insurance, not always with good results, impact bonds, investing in startups. So this is something more exploratory, and I wouldn't say we are convinced yet that this is the way to go and we are shifting completely. We have pressures internally, also on our human resources internally. So this limits us in our ability to do also delocalization, exploring new ways. And you have to understand that we are also subject to internal politics. So we have to show somehow that we have an added value, in my case, as Switzerland. So these are pressures that are kind of against localization. We have also indicators that we have to meet, which may be sectoral. And then the big pressures on compliance. Can we be certain that our funds are well used? So this is the sphere. We would like very much more localization. We need it for effectiveness, but we have quite a few barriers.
Thanks very much for that open insight, Ali. We do not hear that quite often directly from government, so really appreciate it. You mentioned already around new financing models. You mentioned even the term insurance. Emma, if okay, we would love to go to you and hear, what can private sector play? How can private sector play a role here? And also, especially in your work at Aon, how do insurance and risk financing models work? And perhaps how can they provide an added on in the portfolio in funding and financing models? Could you maybe share some of your thoughts there?
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me today. I think the private sector has always wanted to engage in some shape or form, and I think we've seen some really successful proof of concepts, albeit to Ali's point, on a small scale with a small group of farmers in Africa, and everybody has sought to find a solution to doing it at scale. I think the biggest challenge has always been too how to do it sustainably, because the other dynamic is that with the reducing ODA funds, there is less money in the pot to go out and subsidize a lot of these pilots, and so we get to this challenge of sustainability and scale. And with that, the supply and demand paradigm has shifted, where you had a lot of supply from the private sector saying, we want to engage in microfinance solutions. We want to be able to do something for lots of different reasons, which I won't go into. But the demand side coming from organizations and governments has always been difficult, finding that money to pay for these solutions, albeit often, or other people to pay for it. But I think now that what's happening is that it's shifted. And to quote a colleague at OCHA who said to us about 12 months ago, previously we were asked to show that we were looking at innovative finance solutions. Now we have to prove that we are actually using innovative financing solutions and accessing the private sector to help finance a lot of what we're doing. If I quickly turn to insurance, insurance is about de-risking operations, activities, and a lot of the areas in which we're working in. I think what we look at it as, from our perspective as brokers, is that insurance de-risks the allocation of funding. And so I think one of the great benefits of insurance is that it helps organizations identify and quantify the impact of risks to their organizations. And they can be climate risks, they can be geopolitical risks, they can just be operational risks. What we've found is that often people know that the risks are there, but they haven't really gone through the process of what is the impact of these risks. And once you understand the risk, you understand what drives it, how much it is, it allows you to create leverage by transferring part of that risk off, much like your own personal insurances that you have. So it allows organizations to do more with the funds that they have. I'll talk to two very quick examples that I think are quite well known in the ecosystem. One, the International Federation of the Red Cross with their DREF program, which is a risk pooled fund. We created a solution for them so that once they hit a certain level of allocations to natural catastrophes, payouts to their national societies, the private sector comes in and reimburses those allocations. The second is Start Network, who also provides a lot of anticipatory action funding, particularly in Africa. And with having insurance in place, they've been able to increase the number of commitments they make to organizations, knowing that they have that volatility taken care of and that risk that they might run out of funds transferred to the private sector. Nothing comes without problems, nothing comes without challenges or limitations. And I think for locally led organizations, creating scale is really a problem. But also, and I come back to this issue of premium financing, how do you pay for some of this, for some of these insurance solutions in particular, that is outside of the subsidy window, knowing that subsidies are not around forever and have probably to the last disappeared for the most part. And so, this premium financing is always the challenge, and that in a battle between foregoing some funding up front for programming and the immediacy of creating impact, to the idea that for the promise of having something in place should the worst case scenario happens. And with that comes scale, because we know that the more scale and critical mass that you have to engage with the private sector, you get the most efficient solutions in the bang for your buck. I'll stop there, but that's sort of just the broad situation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma. Very interesting to hear the examples as well. So for the audience here, and Jessie, maybe you can enlighten us a bit with your experience and what you hear. If we're really talking about diversifying your funding in fundraising, but also beyond fundraising to those new financing models, do you sense maybe in your data or in your experience with a lot of the organizations that you're working with, where do you see the next opportunities?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And in some ways that answer, based on what we saw in our data and then what we see generally in our work, that answer shifts slightly based on the location of the organization and a few other factors, as there are different local opportunities in different contexts. The World Giving Report findings really demonstrate that donors' generosity and ways of giving in high and low income countries vary significantly, with Africa as a continent being the most generous in the world. We looked at it based on the structured against the income of those individuals versus how much they were giving in different ways. And then findings show that, countries where community and familial ties are deeply embedded into the culture, the giving trends increase and tend to reflect those values. But in the face of these really clear financial constraints that we're seeing across the sector, we're also seeing charities take a more networked approach. So, thinking about these other types of giving vehicles that you mentioned, we are seeing a networked approach amongst charities, emphasizing collaboration with other organizations, trying to collaborate with the government, although, those opportunities are more limited these days, as well as with the private sector and with international organizations as an essential for resource sharing, building capacity, and scaling impact. But alongside of, the local giving and network building that we're seeing kind of that an approach that organizations are taking and finding some success in, we are definitely seeing increased use in pooled funds and climate adaptation finance. And, there's a lot of talk about different trust-based philanthropic and private sector partnerships emerging as some realistic pathways. I think, we need some more time to see how that will really play out and how accessible that those types of partnerships are to local organizations. But specifically, we're looking at those types of funds that are structured specifically to reduce burdens and keep decision-making close to communities. So, there are definitely lots of emerging tools out there that should be considered in the context, but you need to consider the local context that you're coming from as well when approaching those different types of tools.
Thanks very much, Jessie. And maybe a question to Emma and/or Ali. We see with the replacing of the traditional funding now to new financing models, also kind of new opportunities arising. So, for example, is ODA enabling innovation and providing funding that are allowed to fail in a way? Do we see new kind of experimentation in philanthropy? Emma, you were already mentioning around your insurance reducing risk exposure, but perhaps you see other opportunities with financing models as well. Any additional inputs there that you would like to share?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think we have really tried to understand this sector a lot and really understand what creates the most impact. It is a shift in approach from the private sector. And I think we come at it from a really basic three-pronged paradigm. Who pays, who buys, and who benefits from the solution or the model or whatever you're trying to build here. They don't have to be the same person, and they don't have to be one group. You can have multiple beneficiaries to a solution. You can have multiple payers, and the who buys really just covers the who decides on the solution, who owns it. And that is one of the biggest challenges too when you're building some of these models. Who's owning that? Or, is it the locally led organization, or is it somebody from on high deciding this is the best solution? So that's sort of where we start from. And I think if you can keep those three issues in mind, we've seen some really interesting examples come out. We've talked before this panel about, some of the supply chain solutions that we've looked at. And what we've done is we've sort of said, what is the impact we need to create? Well, whose best interest is in this apart from the locally led organization? Well, obviously, if you think about a agricultural supply chain, it's the off-taker, the contractor who has a great interest in making sure that the supply is still coming. What can they pay for that benefits both that local community and also themselves? Everybody needs to see something in it. And then who's paying for it? So if they've got an interest, they can pay for it. They can relieve the local organizations that burden of trying to find a solution here by investing in local things or in local projects. We've done it with coffee. We're working with dairy farmers in Uganda. There's lots of different ways you can start to build this picture. All about how do you fill that gap in ODA funding that Ali was talking about earlier. And it's not just about agriculture or some of the primary industries, but also about entrepreneurs. How do you protect the money that can catalyze other forms of finance? Donor funding is is very scarce, but it also can only go in certain situations and certain environments. It can catalyze and prepare the ground for the private sector to step in and fill and build models around some of these solutions to help fill that ODA gap. But it really does come down to who pays, who buys, and who benefits. I'll stop there because I know there's a lot of questions coming.
Thanks, Emma. Ali, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, from STC side, I would say we have always been open to innovation. I mean, development cooperation. That's a constant looking for solutions, and we're not afraid of it. We like to have some traditional things because we assume that we will get measurable impacts from that we can show our constituency, I mean our taxpayers. And then innovation, we have always done it, and we're not afraid of failure. Look at Haiti. How much has the international community invested in it, poured money into it? I would say we haven't found a solution yet. So we will go on trying, and we do have part of our finances that are open to innovations like insurances, like impact premiums. We like to take it gradually, generally, to have something traditional funding, but then an impact premium if results are reached more than foreseen. These are possibilities. I think often we fail because we don't understand the situation at the local level. We have to work in some kind of model. We can argue that it pays off to invest in disaster risk reduction to prevent an event that may happen every 5 years or every 10 years. Of course, we can't do an insurance for a yearly event, but then for us, we make the economic calculation. What's the cost of money? It's about 0% right now. But for a farmer in Honduras, she or he pays maybe 8% per month. So that's a whole different reality, and this means that we have to that there is a different understanding of the needs and of the potential solutions. Over from me.
I just wanted to add to Ali. I think what's really important here and what we've experienced in our projects and the solutions we've put in place is that it comes down to a couple of things. One, collaboration, but most of all, trust. And I think everybody in that group has to trust each other that they're working for the right reasons. And that comes back to a great level of transparency, but also collaboration as well in terms of being able to be very open, which is not a private sector approach, right? The private sector, there's always holding stuff back, but we've found when we pick the right partners and everybody understands the goal and listens to the locals, right? We don't come at this and say we have a solution. Our view is we come with money and we can work out how to get you that money for that risk that sits around what you want to achieve. And that's it. We don't try. And I think that's a really important part of any kind of model or solution is that right ecosystem of partnership and collaboration, transparency, but most of all, and that all gets wrapped up in trust.
Thanks for that, and thanks Ali as well for your input there and really steering on that innovation part, also as a kind of an instigator to create new long-term solutions. Zameer, I want to come back to you because we hear, yes, there are a lot of new opportunities out there, but you as a local organization, how do you get in connection with the new funding opportunities? How is your site looking like, and are there any maybe barriers that you came along the way?
Looking at the current landscape, we see a distinct duality. On one hand, there are genuine opportunities in climate adaptation and resilience financing areas where Star Foundation operates directly in the Kashmir region. But on the other hand, there are massive systematic barriers that prevent local actors from accessing these opportunities. The biggest barrier I see, what I call the knowledge and compliance gap. It is not a lack of capability in the field. We know our communities better than anyone. The barrier is the access mechanism. We often face reporting complexities and scale requirements that are designed for large international NGOs, not local grassroots organizations. For a local organization based in a remote district like Bag, the cost of compliance, both in time and money, can sometimes feel like a barrier to entry. Donors often have a low risk appetite for local organizations, perceiving us as risky because we lack the expensive financial systems they are used to seeing. This forces many of us to rely on intermediaries to access funds, which dilutes the resources meant for the community. The local leadership academy was the bridge that helped us across this gap. It demystified these processes. It taught us that we could handle rigorous reporting if we were given the right tools. For example, with our TVO project, we managed two installments with full transparency, maintaining visual evidences and detailed financial tracking that proved we were a safe pair of hands. So, what is not working, the system is still biased against those without access to training and capacity building. If we want to fix this, funders need to recognize that investing in the capacity of local leaders is just as important as funding the projects they implement. We need to move beyond trust-based philanthropy to trust-based capacity building. This is my take from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Zameer. I like your trust-based capacity building beyond trust-based philanthropy alone. What we often see is that the different parties, funders, fundraisers, funders, civil society organizations, they still operate too much in silos. So by creating the solutions, it would be so beautiful to create them together. And maybe this panel is a beautiful example of having the different stakeholders together. Ali, I want to come back briefly to you because 2 weeks ago there was also the Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week in Geneva, where a couple of these topics came back as well. Yes, you hear Zameer, we really would love to receive that direct funding. We understand from a funder of governmental funding that it's sometimes difficult to manage everyone without having very big teams in place. Is there any solutions about eliminating the intermediaries to do more direct? What are some answers there, maybe from your end, if you're hearing Zameer's point?
Yeah, one positive element of answer is that we are ready. The international community of funding agencies, donors, we acknowledge that there is a need to build this local or localized infrastructure for development cooperation through these local organizations. We need to invest in their capacities, to trust them. This is something that we have to do despite our shortness of own resources, which limits us directly making this, but we could use intermediary agents for that capacity building and then channel the resources more directly. But it is clear that compliance is very key for us. I mean, you have one case of non-compliance or several, and your funding goes down immediately. I mean, for us as a donor agency as well as a governmental. I mean, we recently had an intervention in Sri Lanka after the flooding and landslides, and our immediate reaction was, why not cash? So we engaged in a program of cash distribution, and then somehow we don't know from where it came, but it easily comes that someone said, "Oh, these ones that are entrusted with the distribution it seems they're not complying as they should do. In the end, it turned out there was nothing, but that's a huge effort for us to always make sure that nothing very bad comes out. I mean, bad news to our people here. So we are open. We know that we have to engage in this capacity building and trust. And on the other hand, we are limited by we are walking a difficult tightrope there. Over.
Thanks, Ali, for that honest response. I want to make a shift a little bit because we heard a lot around new funding opportunities that are out there. And thanks very much, Ali and Emma, of exchanging your views on what is out there and available. But it also means often an adaptation within the organization itself. And I really wanted to ask you, Zameer, if we are looking usually at organizations who manage really well in kind of shifting funding paradigms out there and shifting external environments, leadership becomes crucial. Often the board and the governance structure becomes really crucial in the supporting mechanisms of making that change happening, but also in diversifying funding and now also new financing models within the organization. Could you perhaps share a bit more around what Star Foundation has done to really create those internal requirements and adaptations?
Yeah, of course, adapting to the new fundraising ecosystem requires a fundamental internal shift, and I want to be honest about what that looks like. When you operate as volunteer group, your internal system are based on trust and handshake agreements. But when you enter the world of institutional funding, the requirements become strict and non-negotiable. For our rainwater harvesting project, the internal adaptation was significant. We had to move from informal bookkeeping to professional financial management. We had to maintain separate bank accounts, track every rupee against specific budget lines, and prepare detailed financial reports for every installment, whether it was the first tranche of 540,000 rupees or the final one. This was a steep learning curve. However, we managed it because we had support from our leadership and board to prioritize these changes. We realized that fundraising cannot be an aftermath. It must be central to our strategy. The LLA course foresaw these challenges and trained us on governance structures, the importance of a functional board, and the need for transparent audit trails before we even signed the contract. Because of these preparation, we did not view these requirements as red tape. We viewed them as organizational hygiene. For instance, when TVO required verification, visiting officers, and signatures at every stage, we were ready. We did not scramble to find documents. We had system ready to produce them. This adaptation has made us stronger. Today, Star Foundation is not just implementing a project. We are building an institution. We are established operation and maintenance plans where women play a key role. Mechanism we set up because our internal systems now prioritize inclusivity. My advice to other local organizations is this: do not wait for the donor to demand these systems. Build them first. It is the only way to turn funding ecosystem from a barrier into a ladder. Thank you.
That's a very clear message, Zameer. Do not wait till the donor demands it from you, but stay in your own strength and start diversifying and building the systems that are actually needed even to diversify your funding sources. Thanks very much for that. Emma, if we are looking at working with private sector, the insurance models, any recommendations from you if it comes to internal requirements for organizations who are present here?
Well, first of all, I would echo everything that Zameer said around the governance and putting in formalized processes. That is a given for us. I think the other thing to understand is that we have as much governance and compliance as a lot of the organizations do with donors. So there's that balance. I think the hardest thing that we've seen, it's really easy for the private sector to find ways to work with organizations. I think it's the flip side. And one of the biggest internal shifts that we've seen within organisations is to understand that the private sector isn't there to take advantage of or maximise, but to help and to create an impact. And so there was a psychological shift we had to see, particularly when working with IFRC, such a large embedded organisation of volunteers that have risen up through the ranks, that the private sector is not just there to hand out money, but can actually provide more services. So internally, the psychological shift is really tricky and really fundamental when you start thinking about your board participation and having the senior stakeholders on side. The one thing I would say, and I think this is something that would help a lot of these solutions grow and move forward, particularly when working in insurance and probably in some of the more finance-related solutions like microfinance, etc., is that a lot of this infrastructure that is needed for a solution is generic, but it's needed for each solution. And so I think there is a real role for some of the big multilaterals or some of the big foundations to provide that technical assistance, because when you're having to put money into governance and compliance, it's even more of a waste, but it's very generic. And so if there was some way for a centralized approach that is paid for by a multilateral, so that money that is raised is not wasted on this, but it is necessary, that would be a huge step forward. And it's something that we talk a lot about in our forums. How do you create that? Because otherwise it doesn't become sustainable, and you get more into those philosophical discussions of, why am I paying for this when there are people that need the money more to build a house or to feed their children? So that would be just one reflection and one sort of call to action that I would give.
Thanks, Emma. And a couple of things that we see there also across our global community across the globe is, instead of doing capacity building one by one, we can do that in kind of joint manners as well. And definitely incorporating, kind of local cultural differences and adaptation. So there are definitely opportunities out there. And hopefully this is a clear message to funders there as well, to say, please do not do that in isolation, but build together, which then also strengthens the building of a community and collaboration work, which is so crucial at the moment. I would like to go to a question from the audience, and please feel free, if you have any questions, to place them into the Q&A section. Ashra was mentioning the question around, because it's very much aligned, I think, with the conversation where we are. She was asking the question, if we are looking at where we are at the moment, are we changing our role as an NGO towards a social enterprise, or even maybe to a for-profit organization? Is our role changing? And actually, what does that mean for non-profit organizations? And maybe to briefly kickstart the conversation there, but I would love to hear other people's input from the panel there as well. What we definitely see happening with many organizations, where 10 years ago everyone was focused on restricted versus unrestricted, and Jessie highlighted that already in the report as well, the really crucial element of having unrestricted funding to fund elements within your organization. What we see happening right now is a shift towards grants versus other financing models that really can fund certain programmatic work or expansion models as well. So what really requires that grant part, and where are other financing models out there? And what does that mean for the role of the NGO? Often, the role of the NGO, the not-for-profit model, is a legal entity. And how we see that often within our global community is what drives social impact. And therefore, the legal entity behind it is almost a secondary instead of the primary focus. And we see definitely also, depending on countries, that there are different legal entities, often of organizations, to fulfill both elements where they see potential to do so. And it doesn't, of course, say that everyone has to do that, but there might be opportunities there. Any reflections, Emma, Ali, Jessie, Zameer, from your end is this going to be a shift from non-profit organizations towards other models? Ali, please go ahead.
Entrepreneurship, definitely that's something positive. I mean, if an NGO, people working now in an NGO can at least feed themselves, have a salary from themselves, that's a first step. If they can manage to have that social impact that we want, and on top of that have some profit for something else, that's great, and we are on board in supporting the launch of startups. If you can convince us that there is a social vision behind it. I mean, for example, we invested in a water purification solution in Peru for a society working in India. And we said, okay, we will pay you for that, and you will pay us back once it works. It didn't work in the end. I mean, they didn't reach the numbers that were needed for paying us back. So we lost that one, but we would have been glad if it worked. And for me, in disaster risk reduction, there's a big role for the government, and there's a big role for the individual, and then there are private companies. If I look at Switzerland, apart from the Red Cross, there are not many NGOs that are responsible for managing disaster risks. And historically, this is where we come from. So there's a potential there in working with this duality: local government, and private sector. And of course, NGOs will still have a role to play where governments are failing and not present. Over.
Emma.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on this idea of the NGO and the not-for-profit. I think that with everything that's happened between ODA funding and this sort of shift to engaging more with the private sector, I think the idea of sustainability, whether that's profits or whether that's financing, needs to come more into the idea of how NGOs look at the world and not be afraid of that. I think the other thing I would say is that the engagement really should be about, how do they catalyze more money coming into the system, whether it's helping an entrepreneur or putting their money first so that the private sector or philanthropies can come in behind so that it is sustainable. I just don't think sustainability has been so much of the vernacular these days, or needs to be more, because, before it was, you have the money, you need to spend it or you have to give it back. And I just think there has to be a change in that thinking from donors, as well as how organizations start to use that money to have a sort of a sustainable element to it. Because although they have an idea that they shouldn't be around, and they've failed if they're still around because people still need them, I think we have to be quite serious that they're going to be around for a long time. And how do you keep that model surviving?
Thanks. I'm very aware of time, and I would like to ask you very briefly any final reflections, recommendations for this audience you would like to share. And Jessie, we haven't heard from you for a while, so could I maybe ask you to start? Can we keep it to the point?
Of course. Yeah, it was helpful to hear some of the reflections from Zameer on this in this conversation, because I think the last reflection I'd share is a reflection on some of the messages he was sharing. It is true that many funding systems are really still designed around the needs and risk frameworks of large international actors, and in cross-border giving, also around the regulatory requirements of the donor country, which don't always align with the realities of locally led organizations. And even where, we hear a lot about intent shifting and trust-based philanthropy, and, but the mechanics of what that actually means often really haven't shifted in a substantive way. What we at CAF America, we enable those, enable that cross-border giving and try to create that balance between, translating the requirements that we have to live by in a way that makes that locally led, funding possible. So that we can give to very localized organizations. But really, I guess the last piece is that, more donors really need to rethink risk and move beyond kind of the cookie cutter models and get more comfortable trusting local leadership and adapting to local contexts and really risk accepting in a different way instead of being as risk averse as many of these systems have been in the past.
Thank you, Jessie. Ali and Emma, is there anything you would like to add before I move to Zameer?
Thank you. I think the point is clear that from the donor side, we have to move towards that capacity for localization that it needed this infrastructure. As for a recommendation that is make yourself ready try to link to those climate funds and the country-based pool funds. These are big funds. Look at what are the conditions for how they are managed, how they can be spent by OCHA in one case, by GCF and others in the other one, and make yourself ready. It's about strengthening administrative and financial capacity, unfortunately, but it is also in building a network, a partnership. With some already exist that can be an option, so that you don't have to bear that burden alone, because you have to also understand that donors will not be able with one country office to manage 500 grants in parallel. Over from me.
Emma.
Thanks. I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I'd just like to congratulate the GNDR on having a broad panel. Not often is the private sector invited to these sessions, and I think that it's really important that in a lot of these conversations the private sector is there, and even often the government isn't there. So I think having all stakeholders at the table is really, really important when you talk about these issues, whether it's at a local level or at a sort of a global level as well. Otherwise, no one's going to hear the messages properly.
Thanks, Emma. Zameer.
Yeah, very briefly, as a last point for this event, if we truly want sustainable resilience, we must invest in local capacity first. Strong local institutions not only implement projects, they ensure ownership, accountability, and continuity long after funding ends. When local actors are trusted and equipped, funding does not just deliver output, it creates lasting community-driven impacts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zameer. It made me laugh a little bit because it was almost the point I wanted to make at the end, concluding this. It is absolutely crucial at the moment that funders, private sector, it doesn't matter who the funder is, but also, the local organizations are together in the room and really trying to find the solutions together. We hear too often that it is separated, and that is actually not beneficial for any of them. And this openness, I think, is a true example around how collaboration could start. I really wanted to give a final message by saying fundraising is tough. We might hear absolute beautiful opportunities here that are out there, but it is tough, and we operate in extremely challenging situations at the moment. So please, any support within your organization supporting, fundraising, whether it's in leadership, whether it's in your board and your government, really supporting that part. It is really required right now to really look at, how you can diversify your funding sources and look at those new financing models. Do you have board members who can open doors for you? Do you have board members who understand how new financing models work, or can find access towards it, and therefore you can find the training to really make it happen? Any kind of support mechanisms very much needed. I shared, and I think there will be a link in the message, that at Resource Alliance we have a global community platform with a lot of resources and free tool out there. So please build on that, or feel free to reach out to us and we can guide you in the right direction. And also, I think when we're listening to this conversation from funders, but also from local organizations, in the end, it is never about us. whether we are a local organization, whether we are a funder. And that in a way is the beautiful thing, I think, as well. We work together towards a certain purpose, funders and fundraisers. And that really requires at the moment collaboration. It requires simplification, and it really requires not to forget what we are working towards. And once that purpose is the starting point of our conversations, we know a lot can happen. And I really want to sincerely thank all and every one of you of what you do to make that happen, and who you are to make the choices to work towards that. So thanks very much, and I wish you a very nice rest of the conference. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
I just wanted to also thank you so much, Willeke, for moderating the panel, and everyone, Ali, Zameer, Jessie, and Emma, for joining us today. I really liked what Zameer was starting with, where you were saying passion doesn't build resilience, but systems do. So I think we've heard a lot about like that. It's not an easy conversation, it's a continuing conversation. So I also wanted to say that we appreciate this, the way Willeke and all of you have approached it today, and that we hope that we will continue conversing. And I also wanted to thank all members who joined us today. And if you have any good examples on like sharing how have you been able to do that internal shift that Emma was talking about, but also like how you've been able to kind of open mindsets of your colleagues and of your funders, and the other way around, like if you have some good collaboration, please keep sharing with us, because a big part of our new strategy is actually to come together and collaborate and engage with all the members of our panel today, not as donors and CSOs, but as partners that all kind of come together to build and kind of evolve the potential of our system. So thank you so much, everyone. And if I can now ask you kindly to follow the leads to the upcoming panels. So just to briefly mention what we are up to after this. So we have one called From Early Warning to Early Action, making anticipation work at the last mile. We have local actors at the heart of localization, and we have United Voices, building strategic alliances for policy impact. So we hope to have you to join us in one of those, and thank you so much.